Okay, a stroll round Tate Britain. Let's get started. This week, we're going into the second room, which is from the Commonwealth period, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment, to the Georgian period, the start of the Georgian period. And next week, we talk about paintings in the Georgian period. But before I start on the next room, someone has mentioned that there was a painting in the previous room that I didn't cover, which they'd like me to cover. And it's this very well-known painting. And I remember when I'm in the gallery, a lot of people like to see this painting. It lifts the spirit somehow, I think, because it's amusing. It looks like, and I was going to say, it looks as though like identical twins. And if you look at the bottom left, you can see, and I've enlarged it, some text, which, and it's still hard to read. It says, "Two ladies of the Cholmondeley family who were born the same day, married the same day, and brought to bed the same day," which means gave birth the same day, is the text on the picture. The two women initially look the same, but it's a bit like spot the difference. The first thing to note is their eyes are different colors. The one on the left's got blue eyes, and the one on the right's got dark eyes. And the costumes that they're wearing, although very similar, are, when you look carefully, are different. And in fact, if you look at their faces, you'll see that their eyebrows are different, their eyes are slightly different shape, their noses are a different shape, and the mouths, the one on the left's got a slightly fuller mouth, the philtrum is slightly narrower. So it's a spot the difference. It suggests, born the same day, that they were twins, but we have the family tree of the Cholmondeley family, and there aren't any twins in this period. So it seems, therefore, that they might be friends. And my thinking is that they were friends who coincidentally were born the same day, married the same day, and gave birth the same day. And this was such an unusual occurrence that they recorded it by having this painting made. We don't know who they are, in other words. And there are no other paintings of the period of this type. So it's unique. Moving on to the period we're going to talk about this week. We're starting with the interregnum, the period between monarchs, or which started with the Commonwealth. And I'm showing you this picture just to make 2 points. It's by Peter Lely, who you'll see more paintings by him in a moment. The first point I wanted to make is the Commonwealth period is known for a complete change in the, let me give you a quote on the Commonwealth period. "It was a cultural revolution designed to obliterate England's memory of who and what she had been." In other words, it was like the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. It was designed to completely change society. Now, the driving force was religion, and the driving force there was to destroy all art because it was thought to be idolatrous. And the Protestants, in particular the Quakers, thought that to have a direct connection with God, one shouldn't go through pictures. So although, as well as a lot of pictures being destroyed in the Reformation, any remaining pictures were destroyed in this period. So it's a revolutionary period, and a lot of the final works of art of a religious nature were all destroyed in this period. The other reason I'm showing you this painting is because you might have heard of the expression warts and all, and it relates to this picture. Over 100 years after it was painted, Horace Walpole wrote a book called Anecdotes of Painting in England, and in it he tells a story about this picture. He said that he reports that Cromwell, who is shown here, Oliver Cromwell, said, "Mr. Lely, I desire you would use your skill to paint my picture truly like me and not flatter me at all, but remark all these roughnesses, pimples, warts, and everything you see. Otherwise, I will never pay a farthing for it. So that's what he's reported to have said, and I suppose it fits his personality as we know it. But Walpole, remember, was reporting over 100 years later, so it was all hearsay. So it probably never happened exactly like that. But and if you look at the picture, we do see Cromwell, warts and all, but we know from other portraits that Peter Lely has lengthened the face to slightly flatter it and has smoothed the skin, because we know Cromwell had a rougher skin from other pictures that were painted. So there was, and of course he's shown in this smart armor with that determined look and the flowing locks. And so Lely has done a good job in presenting him, even with the warts and all. Let's move on though. That's a bit of background. So let's start, as last week, with the front of Tate Britain. We walk up the steps, go straight on through the corridor, down through the Devine Gallery, turn left, and we go into the 1540 room that we saw last week. Then we turn right and go through to the room that we're looking at this week. And here we are, we've just come through and turned to our left. And you can see in the room we've just left, notably the first full-length picture, very startling picture of Queen Elizabeth I in that red dress against the gold background. But let's move on. This week, the leading artist of the period is Peter Lely, and there's 3 pictures we're going to start with that are all Lely's down this wall. But it enables me to talk a bit about the art of the period, which has moved on a lot. You'll also notice how art is evolving. It wasn't highly regarded in the Tudor period, but it was now becoming very highly regarded because kings and senior nobility amassed large collections. But let's look at this Peter Lely. Unusual because most of the paintings, the most popular paintings, the paintings people spent money on in Britain, not in other countries, in Britain, were portraits. Vast majority of paintings were portraits. But this isn't. This is a Bible story from a story actually of Susanna and the Elders. That's the title of the painting, and it's a common theme for artists. A story from the Catholic Bible or the Apocrypha, but it's not a story, it's not in the King James's Bible. Maybe I should tell you the story first. Looking at the picture, there's a young woman who's recently got married to a senior person in the community. There are 2 elders of the community that often visited the house to meet her husband, and that they saw her and became enamored with her. I'll shorten the story a bit, but they hid in her garden. One day it was hot and she was going to have a bath. She wanted to have a bath in the garden. She asked her 2 servants to go and fetch soap and oil. And when they left, the servants left, the 2 elders came out of hiding and threatened her, as we see at this point, that unless she had sex with them, they would publicly accuse her of having adultery with a young man that they'd invented, that they would tell everybody was in the garden. And the penalty for adultery was death. She rejects them because she's honorable. She screams, they immediately accuse her. The next day she's sentenced to death, but as she's being led away, young Daniel says to the community, "May I cross-examine the elders because I have a feeling she's not guilty." They allow him to cross-examine them. And he examines them, he questions them separately, and they each have different versions of the story. One says they hid under a bush and the other says they hid under an oak tree. So everyone realizes they'd made it up. She is freed and they are executed the same day. That's the story. So what most artists love this story for is it enables them to show a naked or semi-naked Susanna, although the Bible doesn't actually say that she'd started to bathe when they came out of hiding. Maybe she was waiting for the soap. The story doesn't say. So this has caught the moment when they've just come out of hiding. Her robes are being pulled up by the elder on the left, and the artist has caught that moment of fear on her part and lust on their part. Just to add, you might be wondering, what's that funny creature behind her? It's a camel. Pause for thought. Sitting on the camel is a weeping Cupid, and I know you're probably thinking, no, it's not weeping, it's peeing. That's true, it is a fountain, but it's called the Weeping Cupid because it's a well-known classical theme. And briefly, Cupid had fun by firing his arrows, which caused instant love, into his mother Venus and the god of war Mars, and that instigated a liaison between them, and Venus got annoyed with Cupid, burnt his arrows, tied him to a myrtle tree and whipped him with rose twigs. And that, the result of that, is known as Weeping Cupid. So the reason I went into a little bit of detail there is because I think it is relevant to the picture of lust, not love, brought about by Cupid. Now, Lely, and maybe at this point, you might be looking at the name Peter Lely and wonder why I'm calling him Lely. Just to, and you can say the name either way, but just as an aside, neither were his name. His name was Peter van der Faes, F-A-E-S, and when he came to England in 1641, he changed his name from Peter to Peter, the English spelling. And he remembered that on the side of the gable of the house where his father was born was painted a picture of a lily. So he decided to change his name from Faes to Lely, the Dutch for lily. Although he spelt it, the Dutch for lily has an IE at the end. He changed that to a Y. So the reason I'm calling him Lely is because it's the Dutch for lily, which is, he said, why the whys and wherefores of why he changed his name to that. But some people call him Lely. So he arrived in London the year that Anthony van Dyck died, and he almost immediately took over from him in painting initially pictures, because he came from Holland, pictures of a Dutch origin, but within 10 years, he'd moved on to almost exclusively painting portraits. And as you could see, he made the transition from the Charles I period through the interregnum. He painted, as we just saw, Oliver Cromwell, and he carried on painting in the restoration of Charles II, because he was just such a good painter, and he was non-political. He just painted, and he got paid well for it. He was painter to the king, principal painter to Charles II. So this is unusual in that it's not a portrait, it's a religious painting, which he painted when he first came over. This is 10 years after he came over where he was still painting some. It was partly popular because, as I said, it was a chance to show a semi-naked woman even during the interregnum, the Puritan period. But you might think, well, hold on, she's not naked, but this is only one of the versions. Let me show you another version, also painted by Peter Lely, of Susanna and the Elders, and this is in Burghley House. And it's interesting to look at the similar. One important thing I think about this that strikes me is that the picture in the Tate has, particularly when you see it on the wall, has, like a lot of masterworks, has I don't know what to call it, a certain frisson, a certain thrill runs through when you see it, because it seems to capture a moment in time of real people interacting, whereas for me the Burghley House picture looks like a painting. I mean, a well done painting, but a painting of three people, whereas the Tate seems to me to go beyond that. But I thought I'd just show you another picture. There was a theme that he painted a number of times. Also in the Courtauld, there's a drawing which is of the Tate painting. And notice, and maybe I should have pointed out on the last one, but the weeping Cupid is often shown with, not with an arrow as it's holding, it's often shown with a cloth that it's weeping into, held up to his face. And you can see in the drawing there is a cloth. Let me point here, this cloth, which in the painting, that explains this strange dark area. That's the outline of the face there, when in the original painting, it's a bit clearer. But it doesn't seem to work very well. So there was a much bigger cloth in the drawing, but that's one of the differences between the drawing and the painting. And another version, this is in Birmingham City Art Gallery, of again Peter Lely, and I think this is notice the cloth has gone completely here, and also for me this isn't the same quality, which enables me to make another point about Peter Lely, and that is he had a very large studio of assistants who painted most of the paintings. So you'll go around the country visiting large houses, and you'll often see Lely paintings. Many of them weren't, I don't think he had any involvement in them at all. Or if you paid a bit more, he would paint the face and the hands. And I think, I mean, we don't know this at all, but for me, the Tate painting is one where he painted the whole painting, more or less, maybe not some of the drapery. Whereas the Birmingham City Art Gallery, to me, looks more like done by his studio. Just a personal view. You can all form your own views. Whereas at the Dulwich, there is what's known to be a copy. So this is and so there were many copies painted as well, not even by his studio, and of what looks like the Birmingham painting to me. So there's quite a lot to unpick from this picture, but let's move on back to the room. Turning and walking along a bit further, we see another Lely, and this enables me to talk about, rather than a religious painting, a sort of a standard Lely. This is the sort of painting he typically painted, of voluminous satin clothing, an idealized image, and building on the sorts of portraits that Anthony van Dyck painted, typically a curtain or drapery falling on the right, and then this imaginary landscape or scene on the left was typical. We have two ladies of the Lake family, although we don't know exactly who they are. 87 years later, after this was painted, there was an entry in a catalogue that says that the elder woman, the one on the right, is Lady Drax, and Mrs. Franklin is playing the guitar, but we don't know whether 87 years later they actually knew who they were. So that's why it just says two ladies of the Lake family. We don't know exactly who they are, but we do know a lot more about the guitar. The guitar had just become, in 1660, just become fashionable in the English court. And Lely has painted it so accurately, we can identify the make. It's made in Paris, we believe in 1660, the same year, by the Vauban family in Paris of guitar makers, and it's been brought across to England. And unlike the lute, where you pluck a single string, in the guitar you play a chord, and you can see that she's forming a chord and holding her hands correctly for playing. So the lady on the left is an experienced guitar player. The other point to make is, and this applies to a lot of Lely paintings, or perhaps all Lely paintings, is that if you wanted your portrait done, you would go in for a sitting, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 sittings, but they would last an hour. All he would do is sketch 1 or maybe 2 angles of your face. You wouldn't be wearing the dresses shown. In fact, the dresses shown weren't really the fashion at the time. It was similar to the fashion of the time, but the fashion wasn't quite so voluminous. And Van Dyck, in fact, and then later Peter Lely, made it fashionable in a portrait to be shown wearing these voluminous satin and silk constructions that he wraps around them. That would be done by his studio assistants, who were experienced at painting drapery, and then he would paint the faces and the hands, or finish them off. And the other thing I wanted to point out about the faces is you can see that the 2 faces here are different, but there's a lot of similarities, which was the fashion. They've been idealized. Starting at the top, the ringlets were the fashion, and I'm sure they actually had ringlets. The high forehead or the high hairline was fashionable. Fairly well-defined eyebrows, they weren't hidden. These eyes were a common feature in the portraits. Some people call them almond eyes. They're slightly bulging to me, and quite large eyes. The noses are not small and pert. They're well-defined noses was fashionable. The mouth was always quite full and relatively small, but not tiny, not a little bow mouth. And so what he did is he captured the person's look, but modified it in that way to glamorize it, to fit in with the standards of ideal beauty at the time. And by the way, the décolletage, the large or the low cut dresses were fashionable at this time. Extremely low cut dresses were the fashion. Let's move on. Maybe that's how we're doing for time. Okay, let's move on to another. I think this is the final Peter Lely we see today. This Countess of Coldair, or Elizabeth Jones, she was well, let me talk about the picture first rather than her. It's again, she's wearing these idealized drapery. Between her legs, she's holding the orange blossom, and the orange blossom is a symbol of marriage and fertility, but also youth and beauty, for obvious reasons. The orange was extremely difficult to grow, and so it was something that also represented wealth, because only the wealthy could afford the hot houses and the gardeners needed to grow the orange bush seen here. And then the orange, the urn the orange is growing in has cupids on the side as well. So what we think is that this was commissioned by her father as a sort of a marriage, not marriage, as an advertisement, and for his eldest daughter to help her find a husband. So he paid Lely to paint this advertisement of her beauty, and she was actually regarded as one of the great beauties of the Restoration court. She's the daughter, as it says, of Richard Jones, or the first Earl of Ranelagh. Again, on names, there's different ways of pronouncing Ranelagh. The one I prefer is Ranelagh, but you'll also see people will pronounce it in other ways. But let's move on. There, for example, there's a village south of Dublin, and he is her father was an Irish peer. That is spelt in exactly the same way, and in the village they pronounce it Renlaw. So, but let's stick with Ranelagh. And also he had 3 daughters, and well, maybe I'll fill in a bit of the background detail here. His other 2 daughters were Frances and Catherine. Now, Jones, and I'll come back to the servant in a moment, but let me just fill in the picture of the 3 daughters. The daughters by William Wissing are twins, not identical twins, and they are the daughters of his first marriage. His wife died, he married again, and he married someone much younger, who is in fact exactly the same age as the younger daughters, the same age as Frances and Catherine. The Earl of Ranelagh married a woman we'll see later, who, when he came home unexpectedly one day, went up to her room, opened the curtains around the bed, and found her making love to a Thomas Coningsby. And surprisingly, he could have got divorced and sued him for damages. Surprisingly, he did nothing. He just went downstairs and got on with his business. We don't know why. But later, one of his daughters, Lady Frances, the one on the left, the far left, wanted to marry him, and her father was very much against it. We don't know how much she knew about him being her mother's lover, but she wanted to marry the same man. And in the end, her father transferred her marriage settlement to Catherine, the other one shown here, who in fact never married, but cohabited with women throughout her life, and was a philanthropist and supporter of women's rights and women's education. The one in the middle, Catherine. A final point, I could go on about this family, but a final point, I said I would come back to the black servant. They were a status symbol, and you will often find a black servant in pictures of this period to illustrate the wealth of the family. They were paid wages. It raises the question about, were they slaves? It varied from household to household, but in general they were treated as well as, or sometimes better than, the servants in the house. It all came to a head, this issue about slavery, over 100 years later, when there was a slave brought from the West Indies as a servant in the house, and the owner of the house wished to send him back to the West Indies. He didn't want to go back to the West Indies. It went to court, and the court ruled that anyone coming to England is a free man, free person, and he was allowed to stay. The person who employed him couldn't send him back. Anyway, I got a bit sidetracked into that. Let's move on to the next painting, or set of paintings. Incidentally, this was the layout on the wall in 2017. For some reason, they moved the sketches on the left. So the only one that remains is the one on the right, by a female artist, Mary Beal, a very well-known artist who painted, it's not clear from these paintings, maybe I'll put up her self-portrait, and also I'll put up a picture of her husband. You can see from the self-portrait that she painted in the style of Lely, and in fact her husband worked in the city, but at the time of the plague and the Great Fire, they left London, went to Hampshire, and when they returned 5 years later, they occupied a house in Pall Mall. Her husband stopped work and acted as her assistant, grinding pigments and keeping the accounts. And she became a lower cost, I won't use the word cheap, a lower cost version of Peter Lely. So if you went to Peter Lely and you couldn't afford his prices, so a portrait might be 100 or 150 pounds from Lely, you would go to her a few doors along in Pall Mall, and she would paint a portrait for 5 or 10 or 15 pounds, depending on the size. And she was very well known and very well regarded, and there was no one else like her. And she was one of the leading painters of the period. So don't get it wrong in terms of the price. She was one of the leading painters, and she was well regarded. She fell out of favor, not because of her style, but when Peter Lely died in 1680, she was more or less at the height of her fame, but suddenly Lely's style went out of fashion. No one wanted portraits in that style, and she found it hard to change style. Now, the portrait of the young girl, the original one we were looking at, the one on the right, 1681, is the following year. So it's a sketch, obviously, and there is a couple of reasons we think why she might have painted it. She might have painted it of a servant girl in order to put in her studio to show people what her portraits looked like, how well she could paint. She also might have painted it to speed up. That sounds a bit odd, but we know from her accounts, which are very detailed and precise, that she never, well, she employed one assistant, but she didn't have a big studio. So the only way she could make more money is by painting faster, painting more paintings herself. And I think here she might be trying some new painting techniques so that she could paint. Her aim was to paint a complete canvas, a complete portrait in 2 hours. So this might be her trying out new techniques to see if she could, how she could paint more quickly and paint without allowing parts of the paint to dry. She had two sons. These are both portraits of Bartholomew. Bartholomew went on to study at Cambridge and became a doctor, but her other son, Charles, became an artist and became quite a well-known for his fine drawings later. So she died a bit, she died poor because, as I said, Lely's work went out of fashion, her work went out of fashion. It's also possible that she was trying to change her style to stay fashionable with this portrait of a young girl. I'm just speculating as to why she might have painted it, but you'll see it on the end wall. Just that painting. These have now gone. I don't know why. If we move on, there's 3 paintings here. How are we doing for time? I think I'd like to cover this landscape next, and we can always go back if we have the time, but I think I'm running short of time. And the reason I wanted to show you a landscape is because this is 1696, so it's the end of the 17th century, and landscape painting was only just becoming into fashion, but not idyllic landscapes. They were pictures of properties. So like portraits, they were, if you like, the portrait of someone's house. Excuse me. And this is view of a house and its estate in Belsize. Belsize Park, of course, is now a busy London suburb full of houses, but then it was in the country. And in the distance, you can see London, and I'll have to point it out to you with a, whoops, with a circle. Hold on, going around the loop again. With a circle up here. It's, you can see various chimneys here, belching out smoke. London was full of factories, but just here, it's hard to make out, is Westminster Abbey before Nicholas Hawksmoor added the towers some 50 years later. So a view of London and Westminster Abbey. But let's look a bit more closely at the house. One interesting thing about the house is that it's very, very modern because it's got sash windows. Up to this time, they had mullioned windows, stone windows, but these are wooden sash windows, which were brought in with William III, who brought them from Holland. And they let in more light. So this is a house full of light that's been built in the modern style. You might wonder let me get rid of that circle. You might wonder what these white posts are. I originally thought they were for tethering horses or something, but according to the Tate website, it's more mundane than that. They're washing lines for hanging out the washing next to the house. You'll notice 2 people walking up to the house and the doors open. And it was the convention for houses like this for the carriage to stop outside. You'll see it can't go in because of these posts, and for the people alighting from the coach to walk up and into the house. It's also interesting because behind the house there's a large orchard. Over here there's a river, a large orchard and vegetable garden, and here a summer house, and down here stables. So it teaches a lot that we didn't know about the layout of gardens and the way the grounds were laid out. It was owned by a London goldsmith called John Coggs, and he had, as a goldsmith, he had some important clients, including the Queen. He was granted heraldic arms, and you can see arms on this coach here, but they're not his because he wasn't granted. This picture is 1696, and he wasn't granted heraldic arms till 1703, and they're not his arms. They're, interestingly, they're the arms of Anne West, who's the wife of Baron de la Warre, or Ware, or War, the previous owner of the land. So I think what he's saying is he has built a house on land he bought from a baron, Baron de la Warre. And so that adds to his status, because he's someone who can acquire the property of a nobleman. And so he's showing his links to that well-known wealthy family by showing a coach with their arms on, moving away from the house. And maybe I think that's two women, his wife has met someone from the coach and is taking her in to entertain her. Something I'll talk about in a moment, entertainment in this period. Later, by the way, Coggs went from being a goldsmith and started banking and eventually went bankrupt. The house was later demolished, replaced by another house in about 1770, and that house is still there today. But you can't see London, it's in a road surrounded by other houses. But one of the earliest, and Jan Sibireks, who painted this, specialized in this bird's eye view of properties, which became a fashionable way to show your property. Let's move back and move around. How are we doing? Okay, because I wanted to talk about this painting. This is by an artist called John Michael Wright, not so well known, of Sir Neil O'Neill. And both of them, the artist and Neil O'Neill, were Catholics. And as a result of, what should we call it, anti-Catholic feeling or anti-Catholic hysteria in London at this time, Wright moved to Dublin, which is where he met Sir Neil. And Sir Neil has chosen to have his portrait painted dressed as an Irish chieftain. So that's what he's wearing here. And we don't have a lot of records of how Irish chieftains dressed. So this painting has been studied. Beside him is an Irish wolfhound. I'll come back to wolfhounds. And the other side of him is a rare suit of Japanese armor of, I think, 150 to 200 years previously. Why does he have Japanese armor? Well, we don't know, but the theory is it's because the Japanese were known to be, or thought to be, were regarded as arch persecutors of Catholics. And so having the suit of armor on the floor next to him, almost under his foot there, shows that he has defeated opponents of Catholicism. That's the theory as to why he's showing armor. The Irish wolfhound was highly valued at this time, and the reason was that in Ireland, around Dublin and the Wicklow Mountains, was overrun with wolves, to the extent that hunters would come from England and in fact all over Europe to hunt the wolf as a sport. It was a holiday. You took a holiday in Ireland, a sporting holiday, to hunt wolves. And when you came to Ireland, you would, hire a wolfhound who hunt wolves by sight. They run them down, and they're very big dogs. I won't keep it up, but just to show you the size of an Irish wolfhound. And they've got a nice personality, and I've read they're good with children. I'm not sure I would trust them with children, but that's what I've read. And they were taken from, people fell in love with them and would take them back home, to the extent that Ireland couldn't breed enough Irish wolfhounds, and Oliver Cromwell in 1652 passed a law, a declaration, that Irish wolfhounds could no longer be exported and that locals should breed more to hunt the wolves, to reduce the threat of the wolves, who were proliferating because of the increase in farming and the availability of domesticated animals for them to hunt. So a bit of an aside there on the Irish wolfhound, and a bit of background as why this was painted. Back to the room, and I wanted to show you this because it's a Italian artist called Benedetto Gennari, and it's a slightly different style than the Lely paintings. It's Lely was dead by this time, by 9 years, but the point still holds that it's interesting that you could see from the drapery and the look of the face that a different style is arising, and there'll be more of that next week. In fact, I'll show you. Have I got one here? No. Let me go back. Let's stick with this picture. Why is she holding this broken wheel with metal barbs, hooks in it, and a palm frond? She is being painted, that's Elizabeth Panton, later Lady Arundel, is being painted as Saint Catherine. And this was common, to be painted as a saint, and also to be painted as Saint Catherine of Alexandria. That was common as well, who was martyred on a wheel. That's why she's holding a bit of a wheel, because and the palm frond is the symbol of a martyr. So it's a flattering. One of the reasons a lot of women chose to represent themselves as Saint Catherine was that it was a passing, flattering reference to Queen Catherine of Braganza, the wife of Charles II, who was born on St. Catherine's Day, which is probably why she was called Catherine. And the clothing, again, is not what they wore. It's allegorical. It's these voluminous drapery created in the artist's workshop. I'm not even sure you could wear something like that. I think it would all fall off if you stood up. So Elizabeth Panton was the daughter of Colonel Panton, who was a member of Charles's Lifeguards. So he was and also he was the Panton Street, which you might have heard of, is named after him. Let's move on round here. I think I've got time just to talk about both of these, and it's interesting to compare these two pictures because this is the start of a type of painting which became popular in the 18th century called a conversation piece. Now, later, the word or the phrase conversation piece meant a painting, a subject painting as they're called, a painting with narrative that invoked conversation. You would stand in front of it and talk about the painting. But originally it didn't mean that. Originally it meant a picture of people in conversation with each other. And conversation was one of the social, not habits exactly, activities of the 18th century, well-regarded social activities. And I'll say a bit more about it on the next picture. Laroon's, this is his earliest known painting in England, and he trained as an artist and moved to England. The picture is of, it's called a musical assembly, but we know from, let me just put it up quickly, we know from this drawing of the painting where they have at the bottom here named, this is the important one, Frederick, Prince of Wales, 16. This one here, Frederick, Prince of Wales. We know who some of they never finished working out who everyone was in the picture. One over here, the Earl of Bute, next to consort of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and so on around the room. We know that it was a room full of the most elite of society being entertained by musicians. Now, Laroon, the artist, was also a musician, and he played the cello. And you can see in the front here, he's brought to the foreground his instrument, a cello. And this is also a reference to the French artist Watteau, who often had musical events, fête galante, and cellos and musical instruments in the picture. So this is building on that type of that genre of painting. Now, it's a question about whether you'd call this a conversation piece. It could be that it's a record of a particular event where the Frederick, Prince of Wales, visited a house and they recorded the event by commissioning this painting. Let me move on to the other painting. And this is generally regarded as the first, notice it's 1725, which is 5 years later than the previous painting. This is generally regarded as the first conversation piece in British art. I don't know about the majority, let's just say most conversation pieces at this time, or from this point onwards, were painted outside. Some were people in conversation inside, but many were outside, like this one. We don't know, it's called the Schutz family and their friends on a terrace, but we don't know what's going on. And it's intriguing. It's given rise to a lot of theories, both about what's going on and the social ramifications of what's going on. And I'm leaving a bit of time for you to look. Well, let me tell you the obvious interpretation of the painting. There are 13 figures that, although they've never definitely been identified, we think that it's Baron Schutz's daughter in the pink dress getting married to the bridegroom here, who are walking up the steps, while he's pointing back perhaps to this group of people for them to join them in conversation on the terrace. And on the terrace, there's people playing cards. However, you might have noticed as I was talking, it's not quite that straightforward, because his arm isn't actually pointing at them, it's pointing at this horse. And I don't think he's saying, why don't you run away and get on this horse and not marry him? I think it is a different interpretation. I think it's to do with dynasties. Now, the building behind them looks a bit like their family home. I've looked at pictures of it, but their family home has 4 stories. It is and this looks like, much more like, the banqueting house in Whitehall. Now, if it is the banqueting house in Whitehall, it's a symbol. It represents the Stuart dynasty. The orange tree, this is an orange tree here, represents William III, William of Orange, and the horse is the symbol, a white horse is the symbol of the House of Hanover, the Georgians. So I think what might be going on here is linking together three royal dynasties of the Stuarts, the House of Orange, and the Hanoverians. And let's just go through the figures on the left. It's interesting what's happening here, because there's a seated woman who is being stopped from reading. And reading was one of the social activities, but it was superseded by polite conversation. Polite conversation was an activity of the middling sort, the middle class, if you like. And so maybe what's happening is saying, no, stop your reading, it's antisocial, and come and let's join the others to engage in polite conversation. That's one way of reading what's going on there, although it doesn't quite fit all of the activities. And in the middle, as I said, he's pointing his daughter at the House of Hanover. And then the woman at the table is interesting, is holding a pack of cards. There's another pack of cards next to her, but there's no person seated with her. She's turned towards the pack of cards, but there isn't even a chair there. And on the table, there's a purse with money spilling out. Let me just move on to the other table. At the other table, there's three people playing, well, possibly two people playing cards, I'm not sure. And we can see the cards of one of them, and those cards have been, I can't really make them out, but they've been studied in detail to try and work out what game they're playing, and it's not clear. So the cards don't seem to mean anything, even though he's showing them to us and looking at us. So maybe at the time they did, and there do seem to be some coins on the table as well, which raises the issue and activity of gambling. Now that's really interesting and a long story, because at the time, I mean, these are upper class people, if they are who we think we are. One is a physician, so maybe at the upper end of the middling sort. And we know from what was written at the time that gambling was a time for was taken on. The aristocracy gambled to death, if you like. They went completely over the top. But the middling sort regarded it as, took on the activity, and it was regarded as socially acceptable because they were sensible, they were puritanical, they could keep it under control. And it illustrated, it was a social activity where they were demonstrating their ability to understand and engage in commerce. They were all merchants and professionals, lawyers, doctors, and so on, the middling sort. So they could weigh up risk because they were business people. They could understand winning and losing. They could weigh up the odds. And so gambling was seen as educational and as a demonstration of their ability to control themselves, unlike the aristocracy, if you like. So reading and conversation were polite activities, but there was a lot written at the time about which activity was the true conversation. So just extracting from one book of the period, they stayed till, this is a quote, they stayed till near 11 o'clock and had neither cards, music, or dancing. It was true conversation. So it was highly regarded, and in that quote, to replace or better than gambling as a social activity. But how much of all of this is incorporated in the picture, and the exact meaning of the picture, I don't know. The final two are are engaged in artistic discussion about the bas relief around the urn in which the orange tree is faced. And I've just come to the end of my time. Let's go back to the room. And if we turn to the right, we see where we came in, the picture of Elizabeth. I'm not going to cover those two pictures. And if we turn back again, if we turn around, is the entrance to the next room, the Georgian period, that we're going to cover next week. And you can see straight ahead, the painting on the left is Hogarth.